This is a recording of Chapter 18, the Synapsidia and the Evolution of Mammals. So for those of you that have been wondering all semester, when will we get to the mammals? The answer is now. Mammals as a group have their origin in the Paleozoic. However, they did not look like mammals as we know mammals today when they first kind of arrived on the scene. Pelycosaurus and Therapsids were groups that were around before the Sauropsid grouping. These are some of your early mammal-like relatives. And it wasn't until the Paleozoic and the Mesozoic that these creatures look more mammal-like. The third radiation of these is what eventually brings us the mammals. And mammals as a group did not reach their peak until the Cenozoic, which is the time period we are in now. Mammals have, however, coexisted with dinosaurs throughout the Triassic. They were a little different than the animals we know as mammals today. And by the late Mesozoic, monotremes, marsupials, and placentals, our three main groups of mammals, had all evolved and were all alive during that time period. This is looking at a very simplified understanding of mammal evolution. The pelycosaurs and then the Sauropsids are both extinct groups that were in the lineage of mammals, but they were much more mammal-like reptiles than they were mammals. These are not creatures you should expect to be entirely covered with fur or to look anything like mammals, truthfully. The monotremes, the marsupials, the placentals, and then the multituberculates are our later groups. Monotremes continue to exist. The multituberculates have gone extinct. And then we have a small hierarchy within the remaining mammal groups. The marsupials and the placentals make up the Therian group. The monotremes are the outgroup of that. And both of these Therian groups still have living descendants alive today. The non-mammalian synapsids were diverse. They were very different from the animals that we have today. And there are these two groups that I've mentioned so far, the pelycosaurs and the therapsids. The pelycosaurs are by far your more primitive. They were found in what was that point in time Laurasia. Laurasia was the continent of Asia, Europe, and North America, perhaps part of Africa in there as well, or part of eventually Africa might have been in there. I believe a portion, the Greenland, Iceland, those structures were in there too. During the time when they were around, these, what are considered Northern Hemisphere continents, were not always in the same place. So we do see that their lifestyles don't always equivalent to what a mammal living in those latitudes would have today. This group was around predominantly in the early Permian as a large influential group on the community structures of that time. The therapsids are more derived. They were found mainly in the southern hemisphere. Gondwana is the continent they were part of. That continent was South America, Australia, likely most, if not all, of Africa, and then Antarctica and India was likely part of this Gondwana structure. The diversity that we see later in mammals is going to be linked to this structure, as we will find that marsupials and monotreme evolution is related to the continents on which some animals first evolved. The therapsids were largely important in the late Permian through the early Cretaceous. and were around during the Triassic with all the dinosaurs and things like that. So let's look at what some of these groups may have looked like. These are perhaps not what you expected as mammal-like ancestors. The top one is, well, actually just about everyone on this page looks like a dinosaur more so than they look like a mammal. The top one in A is Dimetrodion. It was a sail-back creature. It has that sail structure attached to its spine, likely for thermal regulation. In B, we have Pelycosaur, kind of a generalized one. C and D are showing different types of therapsids. Dinocephalion for C and Gorgonocepsid for D. And then E is showing a cynodont, which we will potentially get to that later. It's going to follow with the therapsid grouping. But here is another one that we could look at. This is also an early therapsid, Lystrosaurus. Not at all what you think about as an early mammal ancestor. You might think of this as a very large lizard, but when you look, it does have some mammalian-like characteristics. The tusks in the mouth, the feet with the toenail structures, we believe. The tail and head structures do have some similarities to modern day mammals. But overall, they probably looked and had locomotion styles very different from our modern mammals. We do see some evolutionary trends within this group. Apologies. They are moving from being ectotherms to endotherms. And as they do, there's going to be some big physiological changes to their bodies. There's also going to be changes then in ecology and behavior. For example, one of the biggest changes is going to be how much food they need to eat, which is then going to probably make them more active predators. It also means once they become endotherms, that they're capable of living places that are colder, and thus will extend their range and perhaps not make them migratory, or perhaps allow them to become more migratory. But we can't really look at the physiology, the ecology, and the behavior because unfortunately, what fossilizes is the skeleton and the anatomy, not these other parts of their lives. But we can, from the skeletal changes, make inferences about the physiology, ecology, and behavior of the organisms, particularly as we use evolutionary hypotheses and can compare them to things that are alive today. It is worth remembering and repeating again that evolution as a process is not goal-oriented. We need to be careful that as we talk about evolution, we don't think, well, all of these were moving towards making mammals. No. Each animal in this lineage that existed was well adapted for its own time period. Every small change that took them from an ectotherm to an endotherm was useful in its own right for keeping that animal alive and allowing them to thrive. But these steps eventually do lead to evolution of different creatures. But it doesn't mean that a chipmunk or a human or a whale was the goal of evolution. If evolution has a goal, the goal of evolution would be to make things more adapted to the environment that they live in. But evolution really is a process on its own. Endothermy does take a long time to evolve, and it is that stepwise or a step-like process where each step is going to reinforce the next. So greater metabolism, more hair, greater metabolism, more hair, things like that are going to work together in order to bring about endothermy. There are some skeletal modifications, though, that we will at least mention. And remember that we can use the skeleton to make inferences about the rest of the body and then about the physiology, ecology, and behavior. There are certain skeletal features or anatomical features that are characteristic of organisms with high metabolic rates. Well, if you have a high metabolism, you should know that they're going to need more oxygen. And along with more oxygen, they're going to need more food. So you might look for changes to respiratory structures, changes to skull openings, the rib cage, or other changes like that. Remember that separation between locomotion and respiration. Those are also skeletal and physiological differences. So we can look at the skeletal modifications to see this movement towards a higher metabolic rate. And we need to remember that higher metabolic rate is necessary for the sustained activity that many of our mammals do today. So this movement towards a higher metabolic rate by eating more food, having more oxygen, eventually results in better sustained activity. So how can we look at the fossils in order to understand this better? One of the main things we can do is look at the skull. We can look at the temporal fenestrations, temporal fenestra, to see what they look like. When we look through many of these groups, we see that these jaw openings did increase in size, and an increase in this jaw opening is going to be related to then the creation of more jaw muscles. The more jaw muscles you have, we should be able to infer the more food you eat every day, and thus the more active you are capable of being. The lower jaw joint is also changed as we continue in this evolution of this group. It changed in such a way that it's fixed a compromise we didn't even mention in the sauropsids. So the sauropsid jaw did force them to compromise their ability between feeding and hearing. We see changes in the way that this new jaw is put together in the creation of eustachian tubes and things like that allow for a better separation of feeding and hearing in the synapsin line, which indicates that feeding is important enough, as is hearing, that there's likely to be some significant social behavior in these groups, or that it's likely to need hearing in order to be a good predator or predator avoidance mechanism. There's the development of the secondary palate. This is the palate that is going to separate the respiratory and the food tracts. So it solves the problem of how do you eat and breathe at the same time. Perhaps not exactly at the same time, that you can eat while that you can breathe while in fact you are chewing and eating. This secondary palate also helps to reinforce the structure of the skull. And during this time, another resulting change was that mammals reduced having 2 nasal openings in the skull to 1. Now, this doesn't mean that we don't have 2 nasal openings at the outside of the skull. We, in fact, do. But when you look at the skull of the organisms, there remains 1 single nasal opening behind the nostrils. There is also believed to have been better control of temperature regulation by behavior of the body. This is reinforced by the loss of the hole in the top of the skull that was above the pineal gland, that was used for allowing sunlight in to help with regulating temperature and body processes. This was the hole that we still do see in the tuataras, but it's been lost in our more extant groups. There are additional changes. We see a move towards an upright posture. This upright posture allows the limbs to move underneath the body, and that is related to that. What I'd already mentioned was separating respiration from locomotion. The therapsids developed something called dual gait locomotion. which is similar to what we see in crocodiles today, but would have been what we saw in some of the early therapsid groupings. They allow themselves to generally use a slow, sprawling gait, but when needed, they will actually move their legs kind of inward by hunching their body and allow themselves to run hard for very short distances. This is what we see today in our crocodiles. We believe that this was common in some of the early therapsids. The limb girdles are more lightly built. So there's skeletal changes there. They're also going to apply perhaps some more delicate motions eventually. There's a move towards shorter feet and shorter toes, and then a change in how the toe is used. The pelycosaurs had a longer foot that acted more as a holdfast, but a shorter foot is going to be useful for an upper stance. We also see the reduction on the first digit of the hands and feet to 2 segments, whereas the rest remained 3 segments. That is something you can sort of see if you look at your own thumbs and fingers. There's a loss of the lumbar ribs, which reinforces the higher rate of respiration. We see this loss in the pelycosaurs. We see that these ribs are there in the pelycosaurs and that they are there in the non-cynodont branch of the therapsids. But in the cynodont branch of the therapsids and mammals, these lumbar ribs are lost. This allows for changes to the internal anatomy of the body, and it allows for more dorsal ventral flexion of the body. There's also a move towards a shorter tail. The pelycosaurs had a longer tail. The therapsids and the mammals had a shorter tail. This reduction in tail size goes along with a movement towards upward posture and using limbs for propulsion more than the tail. The tail then took on the role of balance as opposed to a role in motion. We could spend a whole lot more time on those than we did. However, I'm moving us along to kind of the first mammals and their early features. If you're interested more in the earlier mammal groups, I'd recommend you read more about them in the book. And I can recommend, if you'd like, some other books for you about these topics. But our first mammals and our living mammals today are really characterized by 2 features, hair and mammary glands. When we look at mammals, that's what they all have. But, well, neither of these preserve well in fossils. We might see some what look like hair on fossils if we have good imprints, but even then it may be hard to tell that they are in fact hairs. And viviparity is something that is very common in our groups, but monotremes are mammals. So we can't say that viviparity is a necessity to be a mammal because monotremes are mammals who lay eggs. But they do need to have some structure of mammary gland, which will need to then feed the young. Question then is raised, when do we apply the word mammals when we look at the historical records? The jaw is frequently used when looking at fossils, but the jaw of the mammals and the cynodonts, as well as some other groups, could be quite similar. There are jaw and ear structure differences. We're not really going to dwell on those very much. One of the other ways that has been suggested is that we could talk about the fact that early mammals were tiny. But does small size really equal mammalian lifestyle? Well, no, not in fact when I look at mammals as they exist today, because some of them are in fact very large. And the transition to mammal isn't just a change in the jaw. The skull itself has an enlargement of the brain area, as well as enlargement of the inner ear regions. And then the jaw changes as the post-canine teeth develop divided roots. But the most important difference appears to be the biological innovations, lactation and suckling. And the changes in the jaw and perhaps the skull are related to the ability of young to suckle. Cynodonts had high metabolic rates. We believe they were endotherms, and some may have even had hair. But one of the glands that we're able to use to figure more about mammals, we don't believe is seen in the cynodonts. And this isn't just in mammals. There are analogous glands that are found in birds, but the Hadrian gland, which secretes oil for preening or cleaning of the body, it is not seen in the cynodonts, but it is a gland. There's a pretty characteristic anatomy in mammals. The liquid in it travels from the nasolacrimal ducts, so tear ducts and ducts around the eyes and nose, to the nose, where it is then wiped off and it is used for preening fur. This gland releases a lipid layer that helps to repel water. If you have a cat or a rabbit or a guinea pig or a hamster, you have likely seen themselves cleaning their faces. And as they do, they're rubbing their eyes. This is in fact, we believe, to get this oil. Some of you know that I have 2 pet guinea pigs. When they are cleaning themselves, their tear ducts release this white, milky-like substance that is used for cleaning the body. And this is related to that. We believe that this oil originally was essential for insulating the fur of small mammals and may have helped with some level of waterproofing. The cynodonts, once again, do not have it. We believe, though, that they did have whiskers and other hair, but that their hair didn't do insulation, whereas the hair of mammals does insulation. So perhaps what we're looking for mammals is not just hair, but hair for insulation, and then mammary glands for lactation and suckling. Our first mammals, when we look at real mammals, include organisms like Morgana from Wales, Megadostrodon from South Africa, Adiobalius from Texas. These are organisms that we mainly know from their teeth and jaw bones. There may be some other bone structures for some of them, but the reason we know them from teeth is that small bones don't fossilize well because they tend to be fragile. Teeth aren't quite as fragile, so they do tend to fossilize well, and that large root structure does kind of help because they are relatively small structures to begin with, compact, but they will fossilize well. Most vertebrates who we've talked about so far that have teeth are polyphenodont, meaning that they replace their teeth constantly throughout their lifetime, but mammals are diphenodont. They replace their teeth only twice. Which, when you think about yourself, you're like, well, yes, there's baby teeth and then adult teeth. This makes sense. We also know that mammalian molars are very different from most of the other molar teeth. There is a difference in the number of roots that they have. And mammals also masticate their food. This is going to be necessary for chewing the food. Yes, but it means that there is going to be a precise kind of interlocking arrangement of the teeth as you are chewing, and that fossil teeth will show distinct wear patterns from chewing, and the teeth should always meet in the same manner to chew up food well. Teeth do this in part because it allows us to create a larger surface area of our food for our digestive enzymes to act upon. Lower teeth are closer together than upper teeth, which is a modification for helping with chewing, and our jaws move in a rotary fashion, meaning that you can chew only on one side of the jaw at a time. So what do these creatures perhaps look like? Well, like this. And this is Morgan unicorn. And if you're wondering, it does also to me look like kind of like a cross between a beaver and an angry opossum. Um, but they likely looked like this. We can, from the fossils, figure out what the soft anatomy looked like. We do this by comparing the monotremes with the therians. And once again, the therian groups are your marsupials and your placentals. The monotremes are by far our most primitive mammal group. And by making comparisons between the fossils and monotremes and therians, we can then figure out what things probably looked like. Our monotremes have a much more primitive ear. The expectation is that early mammals would have been the same. The cochlea is not highly coiled in the ear, and they probably also, like the monotremes, lacked an external ear. External ears are probably something that evolved later. Monotremes do produce milk, but they lack nipples. This is an advance that we see only in the therians. That means the monotremes have these areas of the body that are just going to secrete milk through the skin surface. Monotremes also have a lower metabolic rate and a lower food demand. We assume that early mammals are likely to be the same. However, we cannot use monotremes as examples of behavior or ecology because we have 3 monotreme species. And they all live in the same general geographic region. So they are far too specialized to be able to make generalizations about the ecology or the behavior. We expect that the early mammals were found worldwide, and thus using a few examples, well, 3 examples from Australia, New Zealand region is not perhaps the best way to understand what monotremes would have been like. And so what do we know about them from fossils? Well, we know that they were small. Judging by their teeth, we assume they were insectivores. And because they were small insectivores, they were probably much like our rodents, meaning that they were likely to be nocturnal and solitary. Because of lactation, the expectation is that the bond between mothers and infants was likely strong, and that there was some important time period for parental care. The olfactory lobes were likely, well, we know looking from skeletons and skulls, were large, indicating that the sense of smell was very important. This is something we see today, true in our mammal groups today. This is likely an ancestral characteristic. Looking at the skulls, we can see that the Pteranodons had large cerebral hemispheres, which suggests that there would have been sophisticated sensory processing abilities. And also perhaps things like memory and learning, navigation skills that would have been highly derived in some of these groups. Well, what do they look like? They probably looked like these creatures. As a matter of fact, these are newly discovered Mesozoic mammals. A is Raphinomymus, who's a predator, about the size of a corgi. B is Volocorotherium, which is a gliding form of mammal, probably similar in size to a flying squirrel. C is Castrocata, which was a swimming rat-sized creature. And then D is Fruitifossa, which was a chipmunk-sized creature, we believe, who did a lot of digging. It's a very specialized feat compared to what a chipmunk has today. This is all we're going to cover from chapter 18. I'm going to switch to another slide set here for a few minutes. Before we continue talking more about mammals, I wanted to actually show you some of the mammals that we'd be talking about as we continue on through this semester. When we talk about mammals, we are talking about organisms that are in the superclass Navistomata, class Sarcopterygi, class Mammalia. And then when we look, we have 2 subclasses, Prototheria, which are our monotremes, and then theria, which are our marsupials and our placentals. And we're going to start with our monotremes, our egg-laying mammals. These are very different than our other mammals. They have characteristics of therapsid ancestors. They do lay their eggs. The mothers have a pouch that's specialized for egg development. They have a coacula opening as opposed to having separate openings for urinary system and excretory system and reproduction. Their humerus and femur are lateral to the body, which is quite different from the rest of us. They have a leathery sheath on their rostrum. Adults lose their teeth. They have fur, but they do lactate. Their ribs continue up to the neck as well as through the thoracic vertebrae. They're endotherms with very low body temperatures. They're restricted to Australia and New Guinea, and the males of at least the platypi can have poisonous spurs on their back feet. They're interesting creatures. And here are our three: the duck-billed platypus, the short-beaked echidna, and the long-beaked echidna. And that is all for the egg-laying mammals. Which brings us into some of our therians. One group is the opossum group, one family with 60 species, mostly in Central and South America. The first toe of their hind foot is opposable, long rostrums with a well-developed pouch, but there are some that have become more derived to actually lose the pouch for the developing young. They tend to be omnivorous or carnivorous. One species is aquatic, but the rest are at least partially arboreal. And they tend to be solitary with only interactions between adults happening for reproduction. As you can see, they are not fully confined to Australia, however, or even South America. We have the Virginia opossum, which is our North American representative of this group. There is the Mexican mouse opossum and the yapok, which is our water opossum. It's our only aquatic marsupial. Within the marsupial groupings, we also have the ones you're more familiar with, are kangaroos, wallabies, and possums. Note these are different than the opossums. They have a single pair of incisor teeth that dominates the lower jaw. They may have another pair beyond that. Their digits 2 and 3 of their hind foot are fused with the exception of their claws. Most have 3 pairs of incisors in their upper jaws, wombats having only 1. These groups tend to be arboreous or insectivores, but the insectivores are a secondary return to being insectivores. This is a more derived state. And there are some that specify on feeding on sap and nectar. The feather-tailed glider, tree kangaroos, wombats, the wallabies, the wallaroos, the kangaroos do fall in this grouping. And here we have some that you may be more familiar with: the redneck wallaby, the red kangaroo, the sugar glider, and then maybe your favorite of all of these, the koala. We have a coarse-haired wombat, a ring-tailed possum, and the striped possum, which look absolutely nothing like the possum that is found in North America. This brings us to our therian groupings, and we're starting with the elephants, the order Proboscidea. We believe these are the remnants of a widespread radiation of giant herbivores. They have long muscular trunks, which they use as a fifth limb. Males have pairs of tusks. They have 6 cheek teeth, and only 1 molar tends to be functional at a time. And as they get these teeth, they actually increase in size and become more complex. Adult elephants need over 400 kilograms of food every day. They can push over large trees to get leaves and bark, or sometimes just to do so. They tend to live between 60 and 70 years. And we've discovered, in fact, sometimes through trial and error, discovered they have very complex social systems, and these social systems are led by mature females. We know that they do mourn the loss of others in their group, and that when one is killed, the young, including the males, will act aggressively, and that they may then kind of act out by pulling over trees and things like that. We will talk later when we talk about some of the social structures of mammals about how male elephants really do need a male to learn from. Otherwise, they don't develop appropriate behaviors. And they have a really excellent sense of smell, poor eyesight, poor hearing, and they yet communicate through sounds, including vocal sounds, and then tapping and stamping their feet. We have some fossils of this group, your mammoths and other large elephant-like creatures that do not exist, and the mastodon. The Asiatic elephant and the African elephant are our remaining elephants for these groups. The African elephants may have more than one, do have more than one species, African forest and bush elephant being separated. And you can see a big difference being in their size and tusk structure. Manatees are our next group. They are found, they're the order Sirenia, dealing with that word siren from Greek mythology. This includes the dugongs, the sea cows, and the manatees. These occur on the southeast coast of the United States. They're found in the West Indies, South America, Amazon, the Orinoco River. They are found in tropical Western Africa, and they were found in Southeast Asia and Australia, as well as the Bering Sea. Steller's sea cow was one that was well documented in its hunt to extinction. There are three subspecies left, or three species left, some with subspecies. These creatures are large, they are herbivores, they grow over 4 meters long, they are relatively slow at swimming, and they're over 1,000 kilograms. I don't have time to tell you everything I would like to tell you about manatees. These are by far one of my favorites of the mammalian groups. They have a rounded head, square, boxy snout, nose structure. Their forelimbs are flattened and look like they're webbed, but really they're going to look like lobes. They have a tail that is dorsoventrally flattened. It has some similarities, I guess you could say, to a beaver's tail and how it is flattened. They prefer warm waters and seem to do well in muddy waters. Can dive for 15 minutes at a time. The adults have no incisors or canines, and they do live well in groups. As a matter of fact, it is rare to find a single manatee on its own. They tend to do very, very well in groups. They are highly threatened by humans with boats. And you can actually see from the tail here of one of the manatees how they are injured by motors on boats. These manatees do move so slowly that they can develop algal communities living on their backs, and it doesn't seem to bother them too much. They do have hairs all over their snout. And you can find on their front flippers some remnants of fingernails. Our next group are the lagomorphs, the hares and the rabbits. They're rodent-like, but not rodents. Rudimentary or short tails. They will gnaw with their mouths closed. And there is a space between the incisor teeth and the next set of teeth back in the mouth. Their teeth grow throughout their lifetime, so they have to eat a lot, and they have to eat things that will allow them to break down their teeth. And they have enamel on anterior, lateral, and posterior sides of teeth. This differentiates them from rodents who only have it on the anterior and the lateral side. Hares tend to be larger than rabbits, have longer black tip ears, and tend to be solitary, whereas rabbits tend to be quite different from that. When hares are born, they are precocial. The rabbits have altricial young. They all have thick, soft fur. They may change the amount and coloration of the fur with seasons. They're well adapted for running, and females tend to be larger than males. This may be related to the large size of their litters. And they do have a good sense of hearing, which is not surprising given their ears. You see the snowshoe hare there, and you can see the color change with the seasons for them, as well as the eastern cottontail, which is our far more common rabbit to see in this area. The pika are our next group. They're found in mountainous regions in North America and throughout Central and Northern Asia. They're small with short rounded ears, short limbs. They can close their ears. Females sexually mature in about 3 weeks and can have 3 to 5 litters a year. This is not going to be uncommon in some of our mammal groups. So they sexually mature very quickly and can have multiple litters every year. They live in open plains, but they are associated with rock croppings, and they will hop in the rocks. We don't believe that they hibernate. They are, they're adorable little creatures. They look like a cross between hamsters and, or maybe they look to me like a little overgrown hamster. But they're cute, and they can be found still in North America. This brings us to our rodent group, which makes up about 40% of mammals. We tend not to think about rodents necessarily at first when we think of mammals, but they are a lot of us. Their big defining characteristic is their specialized gnawing, with a single pair of upper and lower incisors followed by a gap, and then 1 or more molars or premolars. They do not have canine teeth. Their incisors are rootless and grow continuously, like we talked about with the rabbits. They need to eat continuously and file down these teeth, otherwise they get too long. I don't know why they're, give me one moment. We're going to look at a couple of different examples of this. The first group is the beavers. There's 2 species. They're ecologically very important because of their impact on river systems. So they do build dams, which actually, beaver dams seem to be really helpful in riverine systems. Removing them is not always as effective in managing a river system as removing a man-made dam is. They have overfur and underfur, which helps with waterproofing. They're semi-aquatic. They have webbed hind feet and a flattened tail for propulsion. They can close their eyes and nostrils while diving underwater. They feed on bark and leaves of trees. And they're territorial, living in family groups. Here we have beavers and a beaver dam with a person sitting on top for size reference. Kangaroo rats and pocket mice are found in Western North America and through South or Northwestern South America. The kangaroo rats have long, powerful hind limbs. They do a lot of jumping. Your pocket mice are not as modified. They have cheek pouches, which we also see in our gerbil and our hamster groups, along with some other groups. Chipmunks have them as well. They tend to be burrowers who store their seeds in burrows, but some may also eat animal matter. Kangaroo rats, who are specialized for desert life, have these strained kidneys so that they don't need to drink water. And here we have some kangaroo rats and a pocket mouse. We will talk more about some of the kangaroo rats in chapter 22. The New World porcupines have 12 species in the Americas. Their hairs do have barbs in them. They are nocturnal, generally solitary or living in pairs, and they are herbivores. These are different from some of the other porcupines. Then we have the New World rats, mice, voles, and hamsters. Over 680 species. And they live just about everywhere from sea level to above 5,000 meters above sea level. They coexist well with humans. Many of them are small, and rat and mouse-like are good ways of thinking of their bodies. They have large litters and short time periods between births. In the wild, many of them live less than a year, but in captivity, many may live 10 years or sometimes more. We have our voles, the muskrat, a mouse, meadow voles, a black-bellied hamster, a wood rat, some other hamsters. The lemmings are part of this group, as are more mice and rats. Which brings us to our old world rats, mice, and gerbils. 730 species here. They're well adapted for life in every habitat as well. They have the same typical body plan. These do not necessarily have as many litters per year, but some in this group have 10 or more litters a year. They have a different mating system than our last group, being polygynandrous. Some of the mice, gerbils, black rat, Norway rat, and that leaves us to the mountain beaver, who is found in Western North America. They're found from sea level through the timberline. They need deep soils to conduct their burrows. They're not social, but home ranges can overlap. And when that happens, they will defend a nest site. They are herbivores. And here are their pictures. Squirrels are another one you are likely familiar with. There are tree squirrels, ground squirrels, flying squirrels. You can see the differences here. They do have 5 toes on their hind feet, 4 on their front feet. It is worth pointing out that our flying squirrels do not fly. They actually glide. And while these organisms usually eat nuts and seeds, they can eat fungi, insects, and young birds. Prairie dogs, shockingly in this group for some of you. There may be a surprise, but they are in this group. We have the flying squirrels, the marmots, the woodchuck, and then our normal squirrels. Ground squirrels, chipmunk falls in this group as well. Coyotes, dogs, foxes, jackals, and wolves are all part of the Canidae grouping. They are omnivores as well as carnivores in this group. They eat invertebrates, plants, and carrion, as well as things that they kill and then eat themselves. They're adapted for pursuing prey over very long distances, which is not a surprise if you've ever seen a coyote, dog, fox, jackal, or wolf run. They will kill usually by grabbing the nape of the neck and shaking it. And they'll usually engage their teeth as they're doing this. This will allow them to either kill them by shock or by puncturing blood vessels in this area, or by breaking the neck. They have great senses of smell and hearing. Sight seems less important. They have non-retractable claws. They may have packs, or they may be individual but either way, they tend to be territorial. So we have some examples here and here, and some more examples. Skunks and stink badgers are another group with patterns of black and white striping. on their bodies. Skunks, as you all know, I'm sure, have well-developed anal scent glands. These are omnivorous and nocturnal groups, and skunks are not territorial. We have our examples here. Badgers, otters, and weasels are another group in our carnivore grouping. Elongated bodies, short legs, short rostrums, well-developed anal scent glands again. They may be social or they may be solitary. And they, like some of the other groups we'll talk about, have delayed implantation of embryos. Their vision and hearing are good, but their olfaction scent is even better. And scent marking is how they tend to communicate. The wolverine and sea otter, as well as the American marten, are in this group. The long-tailed weasel, American badger, the mink. Raccoons are one of our next groups. They're found from Canada through Argentina. They are plantigrade like we are. Some are social, some groups are solitary, and they all have some level of arboreal life, with many of them being nocturnal. The coyotes are in here, as well as the ringtail. Bears, there are 8 species that are left that are distributed in the northern hemisphere. Historically, they did range into Africa and South America, but some of those have gone extinct in the past. They tend to be habitat generalists. They're large, and the males can be twice the size of females, sometimes even larger than that. They're plantigrade. They're usually solitary, and they're nocturnal or crepuscular. They generally have no predators other than those of humans. We have our examples here, and then the ones you're likely more familiar with. Cats are very, very specialized carnivores. They only tend to eat the things that they have caught and killed themselves. With the exception of the cheetah, they have retractable claws. Their teeth are for shearing as opposed to grinding food. Their hunting is stalking, followed by a quick ambush. And they usually sever the cervical vertebrae of their prey with their canines. They have a well-developed sense of sight, and they tend to be solitary with the exception of lions. And there are some instances where male cheetahs will exist in groups. We'll talk more about that later with the mammal chapters. Lots of cat representatives. This brings us to our ungulates. There are even-toed and odd-toed versions of the ungulates. The even-toed ungulates have 220 species. They have lost the first digit, and the second and fifth have been reduced. The third and fourth digits tend to be the ones who bear weight. They have either horns or antlers, and their stomachs are usually modified for fermentation. They're found all throughout the continents with the exception of Australia and Antarctica. This includes things like the impala, the sheep, bison, buffaloes, mountain goats, mountain sheep, camels, llamas, elk, deer, and moose are in this group, as well as hippopotamus and the pigs and giraffes. Bats are our only flying mammals. They may feed on fruit, nectar, or pollen, or insects, and they do have very specific roosting requirements. Here's some examples of bats. And we have our odd-toed ungulates, where there are only 3 living families and 18 species. This, in the fossil record, this was a very rich group. They're found in Africa, Asia, North America, and northern South America. They are herbivores, and the largest land mammal that ever lived is an extinct species of rhinoceros that weighed over 30,000 kilograms or 5 times as much as your modern elephants. These are the rhinoceroses, the zebras, and the horses. That is it for this recording. Thank you so much.